This is Zero Signal, where security leaders stop waiting for certainty and start leading through it. I'm Conor Sherman.
And I'm Stuart Mitchell.
Let's get into it. Zero Signal is brought to you by Sysdig. Threat actors are compromising cloud accounts in under 8 minutes. Vulnerabilities are being exploited within 10 hours of disclosure. That's the defender's window, and it keeps closing. Attackers aren't waiting on dashboards. They go straight for what's running. Real time is the only timeline that matters. And that's why Forrester named Sysdig a leader in its latest wave for the cloud-native application protection platforms. Runtime is where real risk shows up, and runtime is what Sysdig is built for. So stop watching and start defending. Learn more at sysdig.com and check out the link in the description. So really excited to get into this conversation. But as life would have it, we had a little bit of a mishap. Stu's basement flooded right before the recording of this episode. So if you're watching it, it's going to look a little different than it normally does. Still an excellent conversation, and we thank you for being here. Today on Zero Signal, we're speaking with Matt Stamper, the co-author of the CISO Desk Reference Guide, former Gartner research director covering incident response, and the chair of the FBI InfraGard, the CISO Cross-Sectional Sector Council representing nearly 1,000 CISOs across critical infrastructure. Today, we're going to be diving into the 4 failures AI just accelerated, why IR runbooks are just not prepared for this moment, and why we need to stop prioritizing securing, instead start building for resiliency. Matt, thank you for coming to the show. All right, let's bust right into it.
I'm thrilled to be here.
So, Matt, one of the things I loved about during our conversation when we were getting ready for this was that you were talking about these 4 areas that we're just not really ready for. And it stuck with me. It's identity, governance, data governance, third-party risk, and vulnerability management. And basically, these 4 disciplines that we've always struggled with. And I've heard you make this argument that these aren't just persistent gaps anymore. Basically, AI has turned them into like these existential moments. Can you just walk me and us through what you're seeing across your engagements and what makes you frame it that way?
You know, there are certain disciplines where there's going to be these constant challenges: identity governance, data governance, third-party risk management, and vulnerabilities. Certainly with Anthropic and Mythos and Glasswing, we're just going to see an acceleration of these. But there's a fundamental issue why these areas are so challenging. It's unclear organizationally who is the accountable party over vulnerabilities. Would that be the CISO? Would that be the CTO or CIO, infrastructure and operations? Would it be the business or unit manager that is responsible for a given system or platform or application? Same thing with identities. Is that HR? Is that the line of business? Is that infrastructure and operations? Or again, the CISO? So I think we've got governance issues that make addressing these topics inordinately challenging. And what we've seen, and huge props to you and Stuart for everything that you're doing in this regard, the timescales to address serious issues have collapsed. As we saw with the 0-day clock, from things that were discovered and then found to be exploitable, measured in weeks or months, are now measured in hours. And so these 4 dynamics, I think, are just going to get continually more challenged as we see the advancement of a lot of these large language models and some of the tools that are out there.
And that's going to be minutes and seconds soon, right? We went to days and weeks and months. It's going to be minutes and seconds. And the over at 3 minutes for Mythos and Glasswing being mentioned. And I think we were right about on the number. So
there you go.
Yeah, I don't think there's too much else to talk about at the minute, and rightly so. But look, you're totally right. I don't know if it's a good thing, but it's certainly making people wake up and smell the coffee, which I think is good. But these are not new problems.
Yeah.
Talk about these 4 challenges. What is your answer? Should these all sit within the CISO org, or is this an entire enterprise approach, and is there not a one size fits all?
I do think respectfully it will end up being an entire enterprise approach, that this is beyond the purview, no pun intended, of any given department or function. It requires kind of a whole of enterprise and frankly, more of a whole nation state to address with some of these issues. I mean, certainly the wake-up call and the watershed moment that we have with Glasswing is telling. We are facing in a handful of months literally just an enormous amount of net new vulnerabilities, many of which are 0-day that potentially have fairly significant impacts that weren't addressed before. And if you're like most organizations, you have massive numbers of vulnerabilities already in your operating environment. And those aren't being attended to on a timely basis. You see vulnerabilities that were discovered 2018, 19, 20, et cetera, very long-lived vulnerabilities. Granted, the fact that they've been discovered and not exploited to date is one thing. I think what we saw with Glasswing is the ability of these models to build very customized daisy-chained exploits to take advantage of them. And so I think our industries in general need to be focused in on this, kind of akin to what we've seen with ISACs. Like here's the financial services ISAC or a health ISAC or multi-state ISAC. I think we're going to need something of that effort to address this. So my concerns are very, very high short term. I think longer term, though, what we'll see is that the quality of code gets better simply because the testing and analysis before that code gets released to the market is significantly improved. So it'll be far more difficult to have that code exploited. But for the short term, fasten your seatbelts. We're going to be coming into some significant turbulence.
I think that's a great phrase. Like this is the time to like buckle up.
Exactly.
And if you're a leader, lead through it because it's going to be pretty nuts for a little while.
Matt, like as a security leader, like, are you excited about the challenge here?
Oh,
thank you for the honesty. Thank you for the honesty on that one.
I think that's probably it. Look, I think this is gonna be really hard, right?
It is.
I think the day of the week and how good the scotch at times is might be the answer.
Or bourbon here.
Bourbon, okay, good to know.
Or tequila.
But I look at this. that's a different party altogether. That might be when we give up. The tequila comes when we just give it all to whoever gets in. But I do think this is as someone who's like, life can be challenging, my job can be challenging. I kind of like going through these types of turbulent times. I mean, the stakes are as high as I think they've been in security for a long time. And Connor, you'll know this, Matt, you too. Like you speak to CISOs every day, but like we have been a department of like the other guys, the way I look at it, the guys in the corner, like, do we get to be cool here? Like, do we get to be like, do we save the business? Do we drive the business forward as maybe some fail? Like, I don't know. We've been saying this for a long time, but like, there's a reason security, like people are more bullish on security as like 2 years ago, people were asking if security had a future with AI. Like, and this is very true. Like some people were saying that there is no future of a security engineer. All of a sudden CTOs and VP of Ventures have looked at their CISO with puppy dog eyes going, hey, we're going to need you guys because buckle up. It's coming.
Stu's right. There's an opportunity here for security leaders to lean in. You, Matt, are part of the InfraGard. You coordinate and you speak with over 1,000 different CISOs. What do we need to be doing so that we can be the hero of the hour? So we can really lean in as the executives that we want to be in this moment. Yeah. What's your counsel to these security leaders who are looking at this and trying to educate their peer group, defend an organization while retool their security operations?
I think your notion of leaning in is the perfect way to describe it. We have to lean into this moment. We have to embrace the moment. Stuart, to your point about accepting the challenge and giving a great big hug, we have to do that because we don't really have an alternative. I think one interesting dynamic is a couple of years ago when everything started to focus in on ChatGPT and everything open AI, all of a sudden security lost its luster in the boardroom. We were no longer the cool kids presenting to the board. Now it was technology and how are we going to adopt AI, things of that nature. And I think our profession was caught very bluntly flat-footed. That period of being kind of ill-equipped, unaware for the challenges that we confront is over. The wake-up call has occurred clearly with Glasswing and everything that is there. I think one of the dynamics that we need to recognize, and we kind of had a little sidebar on this before, not every CISO, not every organization is cloud native, microservices, building their own applications and code. They're running legacy infrastructure. They've got manufacturing sites with operational technology and facility management technology, or they're in very slow moving industries like healthcare. IT moves quick. This control and governance around it tends to be a little bit more challenged given resources. So I think one of the things that we need to do is not leave the uplifting, kind of how do we skill up for this moment to chance. And that means being very proactive at a national level with all the different critical sector industries that we have, be it chemical, manufacturing, transportation, whatever the case may be. We need to have detailed, concrete plans to help them to address this particular moment, and then allow CISOs to be comfortable with the fact that the way things are moving right now are literally moving so quick, it's impossible to know everything. And I think there's a perception that the CISO, he or she, must be omniscient. They need to know anything and everything all the time about every technology stack, its history, all the different protocols, all the different IEEE analyses, everything that's out there. And it's impossible. And so we're going to have to embrace a degree of, what is it that I don't know that I should know? Why don't I know it? And not come in with all kind of bravado and thinking we're the head honcho in the room. No, this is a larger issue that requires all of us to collaborate and share best practices and help fellow colleagues along the route, as it were.
So let's say you're talking to your CISO network now, and maybe you're advising someone in this group. Let's go back to your 4 persistent failures, which we talked about. How are you communicating that to a board? Because typically they don't want to get deep in the detail, but how are you recommending that we get better, and where are you telling them to
I'm going to say something that's going to piss off a lot of people that are on boards of directors. I think it's borderline negligence when members of the board say, okay, here's 5 minutes or 15 minutes for security, needs to be a single slide, things of that nature. No, they're dealing with existential issues with their organizations. They're providing, strategy and guidance. How do we make the right choices to move this organization into the future? We can't walk away from detail. And I think boards, just like CISOs and every other stakeholder in an organization, they need to lean into this moment. They too, like other CISOs and other, C-suite executives, they need to educate. They need to make sure that they're well versed on all the different risks that are happening, the rapidity or the timescales that these risks are going to hit our organizations. They cannot just kind of willy-nilly sit by and go, I'd like a nice slide deck and, make it a lot of graphics because, I don't want to read. God forbid I had to read something 10 pages long to understand an issue. I don't think that's acceptable anymore.
Do you think some of that lies with some of the CISO predecessors who've done a pretty crappy job of presenting to the point where they're like, I can't sit through another one of these? I know. I think there's 2 sides to blame here.
In the CISO Desk Reference Guide, one of the things that I highlighted was just doing a simple business impact analysis, just doing a BIA, but not an overly complicated one. Just as simple as, how does the company or the organization derive enterprise value? What is it there for? What customers does it serve? Sectors, markets? What are the risks that are out there against being able to derive that enterprise value, and how we're controlling them? What's happened, I think, is in many cases, CISOs have been overly technical in the way they describe risk versus doing that translation, converting that technical risk into business impact. And the BIA, again, it doesn't have to be complicated, but a BIA is the perfect vehicle to express that. I've built out BIA templates now that are 2 pages that you can go and meet with somebody, spend an hour or 2, and you get a really good understanding of a corporate function. It's the distillation and the aggregation of all those different kind of, entity or function or process specific BIAs that, provides kind of the fodder that you would end up communicating to the board of directors. But CISOs have to communicate in business language. When we don't, we lose that audience.
That's really good counsel. I mean, there's 2 parts to that. Like, one, like the business impact assessment. My last organization, where I was the CISO there, we had 3 business units. We had 6 different product lines. It was a SaaS company, 4 different compliance regimes. So what I do, I didn't give them that detail. I just said, okay, here's your product line. Here's how you make money per product line. And we tied the entire risk program to each line of the product. Why? Because that's how I could go to finance and be like, hey, finance, I need to understand these things and tie these things together. It was, as you're describing, you need to meet the business in how they're architected, not just like technically, but like as a business.
And use the language of that business. Each organization has its own vernacular and jargon that it uses. We have to be communicative in those terms, not ours.
So, Matt, one of the things I found is so instrumental about your work here is that you're not just like identifying these 4 classic failure moments, and a lot of it has to do with like accountability, ownership, and the through line through what is really like kind of a messy area. But you've actually been running these tabletop exercises where really you're getting a chance to pressure test these run books and seeing what are the failure moments and how's this. I'd really like to see like how is that world working now that we have this agentic world? Where are agents, if you will, showing up inside of these run books? Like you spent 2 years at Gartner covering instant response architecture. You've run tabletops across dozens of organizations. Tell us a little bit more about what you're seeing and how are we preparing? What's the state of play when it comes to preparing for incident response in the age of AI?
This is where I go back to Stuart's question is, are we a little bit afraid about what's about to happen? My response is this is the area that really does drive concern. I don't think that organizations are modeling into their incident response programs, first and foremost, the timescales. I think we always think of luxury. We have, a handful of hours, or we have
Yes.
maybe a day or two to review and triage this thing. No, the game's lost in the matter of the first couple of seconds of the attack in most cases when things are operating at machine speed. Then you start thinking about those timescales when you start to coordinate outside of the security department. I've got counsel. Do I do this particular response under privilege? If so, how quickly can I find an attorney, kind of get the engagement under privilege, those types of activities? I think we need to take pause with respect to our incident response programs and just ask fundamental questions. Have we modeled in AI risk to our responses to any number of different scenarios? Do we understand the new timescales? We do not have the luxury of days or hours. We now have effectively minutes, which requires us to be much more automated in our responses, which is trusting the system a lot more than we historically used to. At Gartner, I covered a lot of the SOAR tools at the time, and they were very good for case and ticket and alert enrichment. Let's bring in all that context. Very few of those tools, even though they had the capability to go hands off keyboard, most organizations wouldn't do that. Our exercises need to ask that question. Are you comfortable with an agent
Mhm.
effectively countering another group of agents or a swarm of agents in a response to critical infrastructure, to a process, just like Connor, you mentioned earlier? Here's the 6 applications that we have, how they drive value. Are we willing to let our our agents do the heavy lifting in these responses? Right now, I don't see a lot of organizations contemplating this yet. I think some are, more kind of cloud native, very kind of app dev esque. But when you get into critical infrastructure, things of that nature, they're not doing that. And that's a wake up call for our industry.
There's actually some really good research. Just shout out to the CISO threat research team, like friends of the pod. They've come across and they published work on this where they've seen threat actors using AI do a total account compromise in under 8 minutes.
Yeah.
I mean, like what run book
Eight
says
minutes.
in 1 minute we do this, a minute 2 we do this. My run books were measured in days.
Yeah.
Like, it's just like this is a whole different game. And then you look at this and you start to see other research where it's like, okay, you have AI that's writing all the malicious scripts and
Mhm.
it's getting into environments, pivoting, understanding its context, and then writing its own code that it executes on to move to the next chain.
And using daisy chain low level vulnerabilities. This is, I think, one of the game changers is that the
Yeah.
attack techniques that were evidenced are fairly complicated and they're daisy chaining multiple vulnerabilities. Most organizations barely treat critical and high vulnerabilities appropriately in terms of timescales. When it comes to medium, let alone low, those are kind of often, no, we'll relegate that for some period in the future when we have some extra cycles and time, and no one ever has that. These models, like Mythos, was able to go through and show in relatively short order, I can daisy chain a bunch of these things and put together a custom attack on a given organization.
I want to linger on that for just a second. And I think I've been doing a lot of research over the last couple weeks since the announcement came out. And I've heard a lot of skeptics on this and a lot of people who are like Church of Mythos on one side and skeptics on the other. It's like a whole gambit. And one of the core ideas I think is getting lost in the mix is what you just described there. It's the depth of reasoning to then chain together these items that were previously either undiscovered or ignored, pulling that together. And that's how it's getting a novel thing. I think that's really interesting. And if we just step back slightly and open our aperture and say, what is the state of open weight models? What is the state of these unrestricted models? They are closing in. Industry gives us about 9 to 12 months before this kind of Mythos level capability is generally available. I mean, and that can accelerate, right? There could be distillation attacks or other type of things that might accelerate that moment. But that concept that you talked about, like how you just have to think about it differently because you can't, that, hey, we'll get to the low and informational or the mediums like when time permits. That's not really an answer
that
anymore.
luxury doesn't exist anymore.
It's interesting. I read a thought piece that came out last week by Haim Mazal, another friend of the podcast. He's the chief AI security officer at Gigamon. Right now, if we're looking at this in the game of who's winning, and we talk about these like Mythos level capabilities, he puts the advantage to the attackers right now. And so I think like Connor, I know you have your clock. I think right now, like we're very much in the hands of these tools are great, but guess who's better at using them? While we talk, like we do a lot of talking about we need to be ready for this, and we are so good at meetings and discussions and whatnot. But like on the flip side, there is in some instances, but the attackers are not sat around in boardrooms trying to get sign off on budget.
I think it's a wake up call. I think we're woefully ill prepared for what's going to hit us in the next 90 days or so.
Bold prediction. What do you think is going to happen in the next 90 days?
I think we'll have some nation state attacks against critical infrastructure or nation state affiliated attacks against critical infrastructure because they're using the models. Connor, directly to your point. In fact, I had a little bit of when we look at the cloud security alliances and Gotti and everyone and the great work that they did on getting the industry kind of prepped and sending out the warning call.
That's why I'm so tired, by the way. That document. I haven't slept for like 4 days.
So. Exactly. And the title of it, like a Mythos ready security program, I think there's a bit of a misnomer there because it's not just that model. There are hundreds of models out there in one form or another, many of which are not in the public domain that are being built by some of our adversaries that are going to be doing exactly the work that you described. And so I think we're going to see significant challenges. I mean, our geopolitical environment is horrific right now. I mean, we've got
it's a good time to have weaponized cybersecurity, right? It's great, right?
So, as an ex-Teamster, I'm always in favor of layer one.
Well, look, Connor, to this point, Daniel Miesler, we're really name dropping at the minute, but another friend of the pod, he talked about this yesterday. That actually, like, the reaction to Mythos is not the issue here. Like, this is going to, in a few years, this is going to be looked at like a Commodore 64 in terms of technology. This is not it. This is barely the foundational layer.
Exactly.
I've been using the language that we've basically just crossed the 4-minute mile. And like Roger Bannister, when he crossed the 4-minute mile, weeks later, if I remember correctly, the next runner did it. And by the year after that, there were 8 other runners who had broken it. And it's like, that's all it is. We've just crossed a barrier. Now the game has changed. The whole field is going to catch up to this moment.
Yeah.
So, and I don't think we have to wait 12 months before the next person runs the 4-minute mile. I think it's going to happen faster.
That's a great way to put that. And if you think about it, like when we think about war, when we actually drop bombs, fire missiles, shoot it at adversaries, there are certain kind of Rubicon moments that really kind of stand in the way before you kind of cross that barrier and start getting into physical violence against an enemy. We don't see that when it comes to cybercrime and cyber attacks. But the problem is that, we've got so many of these systems that control operational technology and critical infrastructure that are connected to the internet that can be exploited. I don't see our nation state adversaries having an issue if they brought down, a big port, or doing other things that damage the economy. That 4-minute mile is effectively like a mental model. There's no way a human can run faster than 4 minutes. Once you cross it, then everybody kind of jumps in. I think we're going to see an era in relatively short order where regions, nation states that have not necessarily been willing to do certain things. The first time one does that, I think you'll see kind of a dogpile activity. And that scares the hell out of me with respect to our country's critical infrastructure.
Who do you see as the responsibility for that? Is that the US government? Is that private industry? Like, how do you view that?
I think it's both. I think it's kind of a Manhattan Project type moment. I mean, you need, the best in academia, the best in industry, the best in technology. Unfortunately, we have been hemorrhaging really critical assets within the federal government that work in this space. I mean, we've got questions related to CISA's funding, cyber squads in the Bureau and others that, there's been a lot of attrition. It's precisely at the wrong moment that this attrition is happening. We really need all hands on deck.
What are you going to do when you get paid 86K and phone offer you 700? Like, what are you going to do?
Exactly.
So, yeah, I mean, that's been a challenge for a long time. And to your point, the chickens might come home to roost here in the environment that we've created. And it's a shame because like we'd love to. And look, some people don't do it for the money. And there's some incredible cybersecurity minds in the NSA, the FBI, the CIA. But look where they all end up, right? There's very few retired cybersecurity professionals out of the government because at some point someone catches them on the right day and they end up in private industry. And look, we'll benefit from that in certain ways, but like the biggest catastrophe is going to come from, to your point, like nation state attacks. And that's where we're going to have needed these people. And I don't know if the teams that we have in place today, and this is something I track, like, I don't know how ready we are.
Yeah.
We're not. That
was polite. I don't know how ready we are is my way of saying I feel comfortable that we're not ready, but we're the politicians aren't.
So embrace the unreadiness.
Zero Signal is brought to you by Hampton North. I've been responsible for building and turning around cybersecurity programs for companies where a lapse in security just isn't an option. Finance, high tech, AI. Different domains, but the same truth. The programs live and die on talent. And no strategy ships without the right people who share the right DNA. That's why I partner with Hampton North. I've built 3 cybersecurity teams with them, and every time they move faster than anyone else without sacrificing quality. While other agencies are still pushing paperwork, Hampton North already had vetted candidates in front of me. Their executive search is not one size fits all. With one of the largest networks of security leaders in the US, their leadership roles hit the market in days, sometimes hours. And their go-to-market practice covers CROs, CMOs, revenue leaders, and full team build-outs for scaling cybersecurity businesses. They meet every candidate, they reference every story. If you're ready to build and scale and grow your security program, go to hamptonnorth.com and see why brands like Clear, Instacart, Airtable, and OpenAI trust Hampton North to build great teams. Check out the link in the description. So Matt, what is your counsel to this? Like, what is your thought or perspective on, we see the state of play, we see the advancement of technology, we see how the AI, as Stu mentioned, threat actors are very quickly adopting the technology. We also have very few organizations that are even at just deterministic, automated response actions, let alone agentic response actions. So what's your counsel for people who are looking at their IR playbooks right now and saying, okay, things need to change. How do I do this?
I mean, first and foremost, any incident response plan and the associated playbook should always be considered living documents. They should be part of kind of like weekly or monthly lunch and learns. Let's open this one up, take a look at it, what's changed since the last time we looked at it, so on and so forth. I think tabletop exercises can be done where you have a third party come in and conduct the exercise, but you don't need that. You can just put your team together at a table and go, Entra was just compromised. What do we do? And then walk away, see how well the team is prepared to address those types of situations. So, I mean, I think it's getting in a continuous response. How do we focus in on resiliency, those sorts of things? How can we effectively take a punch and still keep on fighting? That's got to be the mantra. At the industry level, we still do a lot of blaming the victim. This company got popped because they didn't implement this control. Well, they didn't implement that control because maybe they didn't have the resources or the tooling, or the CFO and the board and the CEO prioritized other company initiatives, justifiably so. We don't do security just for security's sake. businesses operate to generate income and serve their stakeholders and shareholders. Security is drafting against that or sometimes confronting that. So I think we have to stop blaming our organizations that have been hit, unless it's stuff that is definitely clearly negligent or gross negligent. I think like in the FBI, they had the notion of this BAFA, befriend an FBI agent. I think we need that on steroids with our colleagues. So more collaboration in the industry, like the Unprompted Conference. Just watching some of those videos has been huge. Kind of the call, Connor, that you and I were on with Gotti and a number of other folks talking about the response to Glasswing. That stuff has to be done almost, continuously. And this needs to be essentially put on notice on every agenda all the time, almost.
Yeah.
It's literally, there's not a lot of time to stop thinking about these. We have to, as you noted earlier, lean in, embrace it. And that means if you've got friends in the industry in your sector, let's say hypothetically you're in chemical and you're in a very kind of forward thinking technology first type of chemical company, but you have colleagues and CISOs that are in a slightly laggard position. And I don't mean that pejoratively. You got to jump in and help these folks out. This is how do we raise raise everything before everything is attacked?
That's what we want this podcast to be about, right?
Yeah.
Like, not everybody can jump on a flight to San Francisco. Not everybody has, even some of these communities, we gatekeep them at some times. And I don't think, I think it's really easy as a CISO of a public SaaS company to walk into some of these circles. But like, is an 80-person trucking company in the Midwest and the head of IT and security, do they feel again, the whole point of this podcast is to help folks and to keep things current. And look, if we have takeaways, that's great. I did want to pick up something. You mentioned the word resilience, and this is something that you talk about quite a lot, which is this graduation of the CISO's role, which is not responding or governance, but building resilience within the organization. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I think ultimately there's been a couple of dynamics with our role historically. I think too many CISOs have assumed risk ownership that doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the business. Our job is to communicate the fact pattern. And so, Connor, like when you were describing the way you would communicate on those 6 applications, the revenue that was derived from them, all of that, we need to be able to do that. We need to understand how systems fail and how systems recover. And then how can we automate as much of that recovery as possible? I mean, we've seen this with the evolution of microservices and things of that nature, where if one thing happens to a container, it doesn't bring down an entire environment or an application. So I think building with good enterprise architecture principles in mind and designing for failure is one of the clear-cut mantras of our day. Back when I used to work with AT&T, and this is many, many years ago, our gigabit switch routers would typically only carry about 40% traffic. So if the A side went down, the B could assume the A side's traffic and still have a little bit of headroom for bursting and things of that nature. And effectively everything in that frame was meant to be identical, same source code, same iOS, et cetera. We have to be thinking about how systems fail and how do we make them more resilient as part of an organization. Here as an example in San Diego, putting it in slightly business terms, we have a lot of biotech and pharma companies, and they do manufacturing of different drugs, but they do it in a globally dispersed manner. So if something happens geopolitically in the Middle East or Europe, they still have Asia and North America manufacturing to cover the demand and meet those requirements. It's akin to that, but across everything within the organization. So kind of asking, how would this fail? What are the mitigants to that failure? How quickly can we implement those and do it in a cost-effective, not so much administrative overhead perspective? And that's tough work. It's easy to verbalize it. It sucks trying to implement it, but it's what we need to do, though.
There's also a thing about resiliency is it's expensive. It is actually cheaper in your example to just run off of one switch or one router sweat. And it's like, okay, then comes the hard work of being a CISO. How do you convey the cost of resiliency to the benefit of the business, putting it on a horizon that's meaningful, so on and so forth.
Just to dogpile on your point, one thing though is even in like single threaded environments, there are still like configurations that can be done that reduce risk. And I don't think organizations use key risk indicators as a means to measure where there may be single points of failure, where there may be configurations that introduce more risk than ideal. And we need to be in a position to have more kind of data driven analyses vis-a-vis that infrastructure, how that infrastructure is managed, and then what would the likelihood be? Back in the in the olden days when I was with AT&T, this was pre SBC merger, all that type of stuff. When we did a 5.9 system, there were operational service descriptions, technical service descriptions that effectively would be designed to make sure you could have those 5.9s versus just going, yeah, we'll give you 5.9s, but there's no SLA credit. There was real engineering behind that. And I think that's what we need to do. We see it in kind of cloud forward companies. They design with fault tolerance and auto scaling and all these techniques. We don't see it as much in legacy critical infrastructure. And that's where I think our friends and colleagues in more cloud native, technology native organizations can really help introduce some of those techniques and approaches to more legacy industries that in many cases are controlling our critical infrastructure.
As you start to think about this resilience principle and we look at business continuity, I feel like we've almost like not fantasized is probably not the word, but we've theoretically put every situation out there, but we don't take them seriously, right? Like, oh, what happens if, you know, aliens attack, if there's an earthquake in Minnesota, like whatever. Like I think we've gamified a lot of them out and we don't take them seriously. I think the last couple of years have showed us like, what if our cloud provider goes down? What if our biggest, our third party and fourth party tooling is now pretty off the charts? Do we need to be more serious about some of the, like the whole thing is going to be about resiliency, is going to be this business continuity, and the expectation is worse things are about to happen. So like, is that whole like almost like a wartime CISOing, right? Is that like what you think the future is going to look like? Which is, okay, all this stuff is down, but we can still sell our biotech products or our shoes or our software, even though we're getting absolutely hammered in these three areas, we are still able to move forward. Like, do you think that's a different skill set? Like if we can continue to be under siege, but also move the business forward?
I think that analog probably will hold true just given some of the disruptions that are facing us. I mean, one, we have, the technological disruptions and the societal disruptions that are going to come from these models. That's clear. We're seeing this already now in the workforce. Certainly, Stuart, in your world where you're helping organizations acquire high quality talent that understands these technologies at scale. So you've got that. Let's factor in geopolitical risks. We've got challenges between China and Taiwan. We've got the conflicts in Europe between Ukraine and the terrorist state of Russia doing all its things. What's going on in the Middle East? And then we have these kind of black swan, a once every 500-year flood happening every couple of years now, or fires and things of that nature. So you have extreme climate change that is impacting businesses. And frankly, I think businesses take this more seriously than unfortunately our government does right now. But you've got climate change, geopolitical, and technical risk occurring. All of this is happening concurrently. So it's difficult to deal with a challenge. Ooh, AI, it's new, it's going to revolutionize business, akin to like, here's the internet and let's go online and put a website out there. But now we also couple that with the geopolitical and the climatic challenges that we're facing. And we have to be prepared for this. Organizations that are not thinking necessarily about disaster recovery, but more appropriately continuity of operations are going to be those that can operate and succeed in this world. And then equally important is the timescale issues. If we know, like, here's a hurricane, we know it's coming, that response is a lot different than I've got a tornado warning and I got to get into a cellar in less than a minute or two. That's the dynamic that we're seeing. We're going to have a lot more tornado-like events that just kind of come up randomly that could impact us.
Do you think that changes the CISO profile as we make these hires?
I think the operating language, going back to where I think many CISOs have failed in communicating to the board, is because they use technical language in a business environment. And that was a fundamental disconnect. The operating language of business is risk and risk management. And so, how we do risk quantification, how we do risk qualification, how we express risk in terms that are meaningful to the executive leadership team and the board is going to be one of the most quintessential CISO qualities that we have of our day. One of the things, and Connor, you and I were on that conversation when the Cloud Security Alliance and others were talking about Glasswing, is we need to bring in organizations like the National Association of Corporate Directors or the Private Directors Association or others of that ilk that are speaking to that audience. You know, if these things are complicated and frankly kind of partially understood at our level, imagine the misunderstandings and challenges for people in different areas of the organization, up to and including the board. So this is where I think the CISO really does need to be able to communicate across a variety of different languages, no pun intended, in a variety of different audiences. But their role is essentially going to be, how do we mitigate these risks? How do we instrument in, timescale responses that are appropriate to the risks that we face? Or how do we address with, continuous 0-day responses? Those types of dynamics that we're likely to see.
That is a really good point. And you use a phrase there, I just want to make sure we underscore, which is this continuous 0-day. And if you take that sentence and say, this is now fact, and you build accordingly, you actually do build differently, right? You're no longer just trying to say, okay, I've got 30, 60, 90 on my vulnerability management. You're like, okay, hold on. I need to do continuous remediation, and I need to be able to remediate and do mitigation before my vendor can give me the patch to do the thing. So now how do I have real-time? And the second and third order effects start to become clearer and clearer. So I think that's a really good point that you're just highlighting. I just want to circle around and underscore that and put it in highlighter. It's like, that's a really good insight, because when you start doing that, you say, okay, we have continuous 0-day. Then you also have to assume breach. And if you assume breach, that has second order effects as well.
There's some conditions precedent that underpin being able to do that. One is more ubiquitous and accurate and current software bill of materials, SBOMs, things of that nature, and then corresponding AI bombs, et cetera, et cetera. Put a bomb in front of any topic or domain, but we need that level of transparency. I think it's one of the reasons why we will likely end up seeing more and more emphasis and use of open source, community-based projects and tools and software than closed source environments, just precisely, Connor, for the reason you brought up. If I'm reliant upon a vendor to communicate with me a risk profile, and them communicating that risk profile opens them up to litigation, things of that nature, those timescales are going to be a little bit different, because the attorneys are going to have to review it, and a bunch of folks are going to have to look at this and say, okay, yeah, we can now communicate out this vulnerability to our broader audience. That risk intolerance is going to accelerate risk, which I think will ultimately drive a lot of companies away from kind of these closed environments into more open source, community driven, fully transparent, fully traceable, fully explainable type of environment. So I think we'll see emphasis on that side, and the inherent resiliency and ability to be performative and all the attributes that you want in that space a lot more than the closed loop environments that we've historically have seen.
That's really interesting. I never considered it from that angle before, about like the transparency is actually this asset when you want to start making changes yourself. I've seen like the flexibility that comes, and I'd given a talk on like how you might want to have a platform and then use open source around the edge to deal with edge cases, that kind of thing. But that's actually a really good point on like, there is more to open source than just the fact you can read the code. You get the whole culture that comes with it. You get all the licensing benefits that come with it too.
Exactly. I mean, look at the communities that we've seen generated in just the last, say, 4 to 6 months because of how fastly things are changing in our environment. And I think there's recognition that, going back, Stuart, to a point you had earlier, this is beyond any company or any organization or any community, if you will. We've got to widen that tent as fast as we can. that brings a lot of administrative overhead into it. How do we, here's Matt Stamper, screaming and hollering about something that's irrelevant versus here's Jane Doe who really knows the technology on a given topic and has this solution. We're going to be in a really noisy, chaotic environment that's going to require how those communities kind of curate the guidance that they get out and how quickly that guidance gets out. You were a victim of it over the weekend with, all things Glasswing and the Cloud Security Alliance's analysis of how we need to think about this. That's difficult. We're in a perpetual herding cats moment, but I don't see that changing for the foreseeable future because we need everybody at the table bringing their ideas and perspectives and insights. So
as we start to wrap here, Matt, I want to really just ask you a thing. If you could bring it home, like if, again, you sit on the council, I have 1,000 different CISOs who are responsible for critical infrastructure for the United States. You've got conversations that are happening through both your executive advisory work and through these forums with the FBI and InfraGard.
Mm-hmm.
What are the changes in either mental models, practices, or belief systems that we should start as CISOs and security leaders inculcating and digesting and changing in our DNA to change to meet this particular moment? What would you leave that community with?
I would say first and foremost, the timescale issues, where you work with the 555 benchmark. When I read that the first time, it was a visceral, gut blow. Because I knew that most IR programs, having read literally hundreds and hundreds of IR plans and playbooks and the like, most don't contemplate those timescales. So I think the most critical invocation that I would have for our industry and our profession is we have to bring time into. We think about, the CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, availability. But how do we do that with timescales, that are measured in seconds or minutes if we're fortunate enough? So that's one. I think the notion of how do we remediate and deal with vulnerabilities on a continuous basis where it's akin to almost like a plane flying. Autopilot is making thousands of decisions as it's going on that the pilot, he or she, is not aware of. Just the bird gets up, flies and then lands, and there's a little bit of human intervention at a couple of key points, but generally speaking, the autopilot's keeping it on track. So we're going to have to figure out how do we instrument into our businesses and by extension into the underlying technologies and processes and applications that we run, something akin to autopilot. This goes back to, I think, the dream of SOAR when it first came out, that automated response. We're going to have to also deal with a lot more kind of probabilistic versus deterministic outcomes. And that involves some interesting dynamics because the US does one thing better than any other country in the world. We sue. And so when things, look deterministic and we get a probabilistic outcome, there tends to be a lawsuit. There's litigation. I mean, behind me is an army of plaintiffs' attorneys, that are just chomping at the bit to get in and start suing companies for whatever happens. We're going to deal with a lot of that. So I just think it's that continuous preparedness. It's effectively, it's a new mindset, how we frame, how we look at our organizations and what purposes they serve, the markets they serve, the products and applications that they build. All of that, I think, is going to end up being refactored in the course of the next probably year or two in being able to address really significant, what would have been what would have been existential risks historically, ideally now are little blips, an adjustment in the autopilot and the bird continues to fly to its destination. That's kind of my hope. But we're in this watershed moment.
Wait until we have Mythos or Glasswing for lawsuits. That's when there's going to be a real problem, as they find every opportunity to sue. We talked about this on the prep call. Again, with your CISO community, like, how ready are people? Like, how many CISOs do you think, if you could grade them like B+, A- or above? And I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but how many CISOs are ready for this today?
I would say there's a generational aspect that does need to be brought up. There are folks that kind of grew up legacy, traditional infrastructure, that environment. There's that cadre of individuals that kind of grew up SaaS, cloud native, in that. I think that group, which is maybe 20% of our community. I don't have a good distribution, but I think they're orders of magnitude more prepared for what's about to confront us. I'm a little bit hesitant about throwing a grade at CISOs.
That's fine.
But, a friend of mine used to say CIO career is over. CISO career is suddenly over.
I
And,
like that.
so, I mean, we've got that dynamic where we tend to be, the person that will be fired for organizational sins that we didn't create. And so there's a little bit of that. We've also had, the boy that cries wolf issue. We brought up a lot of these issues. We spent billions and billions and billions of dollars to protect our organizations, but we still get compromised. We still have data breaches. Our record as a profession, if you measure it objectively, is somewhat piss poor. I mean, companies are getting hacked. Data is being stolen. If we were working in the airline, if 1 out of every 10 flights crashed, how we would look at flying would be really different. But,
Yes.
In our profession, but I think in kind of a semi excuse for our profession is, a lot of times we were buried deep in the organization. So we were porting into a CIO and he or she had other priorities and things that they cared about. So our message was being intermediated. We have folks that were too technical trying to describe, other forms of risk to the board of directors. My hope is, as a profession, we mature very quickly into what's on the tracks heading at us, and that's going to require not a lot of blame game, but more appropriately, how do I help you? What do we need to do to like here in San Diego, we have a San Diego CISO roundtable, and our community is very collaborative. If a company is going through an issue, somebody will put something out there, and then moments later, you see people responding back. Here with
That's
our
great.
local FBI InfraGard chapter, we have a cyber council where we've identified security leaders in critical infrastructure, not the IT sector, but in critical infrastructure. When we see things, we communicate it. So my hope is we have a lot more collaboration and less, name calling and blaming in this space, because these are real serious problems. I mean, it's not
Yeah.
an easy solution, I think.
I just want to say, Matt, just thank you so much for coming on the show, mate. Like, this has been really, really, really cool. I love how you've got this really great insight into the community around security leaders, and specifically how you're creating moments of community for that information sharing that you were describing. As a reminder, Matt is the co-author of the CISO Desk Reference Guide, a dearly beloved book by many, many CISOs, former Gartner research analyst, running his own executive advisory firm now, and the chair of the FBI InfraGard CISO Cross-Sectional Council, representing over 1,000 CISOs across critical infrastructure. Matt, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
It was a pleasure, and thank you guys for the work that you're doing. It's critical.
If today's conversation gave you something useful, a framework, a question worth sitting with, a way to position something you're already dealing with, that's the point. Connect with Conor and I on LinkedIn. The links are in the show notes. Tell us what landed.
And if you know another security leader who's navigating the same pressure, text them this episode. We'll see you next time.
Resonate.